Hello, everyone. Welcome to the official launch of Sustainable Energy for All's Energizing Finance Research Series 2021, organized in collaboration with Climate Policy Initiative and Dalberg Advisors. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Thamojit Chatterjee, Energy Specialist at Sustainable Energy for All, and I have the good fortune today to be your host for the next hour. Thank you for joining us. We have a great program lined up for you, sharing data and information along with recommendations on where financial commitments for sustainable energy stands and the volume and type of capital required to ensure the world achieves SDG 7, that is, ensuring universal access to sustainable, reliable, modern energy for all by 2030. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, and we do hope to provide you with an opportunity to learn, engage, and be inspired and energized. Speaking of energized, the Energizing Finance Research Series is recognized as the first and only systematic analysis of finance commitments, disbursements, and needs in countries with the largest energy access gaps. Through peer-reviewed methodologies and findings, this research leverages proprietary data to identify financing trends, gaps, and innovations that will inform achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 7. As you stay with us learning about our findings, we encourage you to share your thoughts on social media using hashtag EF2021 or hashtag SDG7BeBold. We are keen to hear from you, and if you have questions for our speakers and panelists, please use the chat box on either the SEforALL YouTube or LinkedIn live streams. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude the financial assistance provided by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation that made this event and the reports possible. We also acknowledge the Austrian Development Agency, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Iceland, and the IKEA Foundation for their core support of our work. Now, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right in. It is my pleasure to introduce our first eminent speaker who will deliver the welcoming remarks of this official launch, Damilola Ogunbi, the CEO and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All and co-chair of UN Energy. If you don't know Damilola yet, well, she is a force to reckon with. She's a bold and passionate advocate for sustainable energy for all and believes that no one should be left behind. Damilola, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tamajin, and thank you for yourself and your team for all the great work you have done to get us to this point today. So I'm so happy to join you today as Sustainable Energy for All releases the latest addition to its flagship research series, Energizing Finance. We developed this in partnership with CIP and Dalberg Advisors. This research is critical in informing the world's action on achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7 on affordable and clean energy for all by 2030. With the COP26 climate conference just around the corner, I think a few days away, the message that I cannot emphasize enough is this. The global energy transition needs to be both clean and just. This means mitigating climate change and creating new opportunities for people to flourish through access to energy that will drive development. Moments like COP26 are an opportunity for the developed and developing countries to come together to commit to clean energy offers that will ensure energy access gaps are closed while addressing the climate emergency. And that is why this research is just so valuable. Energizing Finance provides detailed picture of current energy finance commitments and the finance countries required to meet their SDG 7 targets. It also provides evidence base for each leader of these countries to actually be able to act upon. There are many interesting findings that you hear about today, but there are just a few that I would really like to highlight in this welcome address. First, the Understanding the Landscape report finds that finance committed to residential electricity access was less than one third of what was actually needed for just basic electricity access in the studied countries. This is a huge gap, but much more finance will be required to establish higher tiers. We don't have to plan for access for the minimal level, but we have to plan for access to empower economic growth and opportunities in these countries. Second, the shortfall in clean cooking is frankly appalling. The Taking the Pulse report shows that Ghana, Mozambique, and Vietnam will require in the region of $37 billion combined from now to 2030 to achieve universal access to modern cooking services. But our research has shown that barely $1.7 million actually goes through per country. Let me stress that again. These countries will require $37 billion of investment by 2030, but only 1.7 million currently goes. This is really failing us as a global community because we know all the harmful things that happen with not having clean cooking. It causes premature deaths. It's a major contributor to the climate change issues that we're having. And climate change really needs to be part of the nationally determined contributions for countries. However, on a positive note, it was really promising to see the finance for renewable reached a new high compared to the previous year's researches. It's a trend that we need to continue and make sure it accelerates. A major development that came out last month at the UN General Assembly and the High Level Dialogue on Energy was that the China and other countries committed to ending overseas investment in clean coal. We now need to see a major investment shift and scale up towards clean energy in developing countries. This is a task for all stakeholders over the next 9 years. It's important to note that we cannot achieve our 2050 goals if we do not achieve our 2030 sustainable development goals. Only concentrated, ambitious actions can secure a low carbon future for everybody. Energy, Energizing Finance can help us focus on the people, places, and solutions that need our support. So thank you for listening. I hope everybody gets a chance to read the report, and I'll hand it back over to Tamajit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damilola, for your insightful and bold remarks and for your leadership. Indeed, ahead of a pivotal COP26, we need concerted and ambitious action to secure a low carbon and equitable future for all. I'm now delighted to welcome Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director, Climate Policy Initiative, and the Executive Director of CPI's widely renowned Climate Finance Program. Barbara is an inspiring thought leader on climate and energy investments around the world. Barbara, welcome to this event, and over to you for your remarks.
Thank you so much, Tamajit. And let me just first start off by saying that it's a true pleasure to be here today as we launch the latest edition of the Energizing Finance series. This discussion comes at a critical time, especially as we see the disproportionate impacts brought by COVID-19 onto vulnerable populations, particularly those without access to energy. At Climate Policy Initiatives, we work at the intersection of finance and policy while tracking progress towards the Paris Agreement. And energy lies at the heart of both the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Agenda for 2030. Unfortunately, we are falling short on both fronts. As this year's Understanding the Landscape report shows, for the 7th consecutive year, the world is falling far short of the level of investment required to achieve energy access for all. Currently, we are neither on track to meet SDG 7, as the report shows, And as the latest IPCC report tells us, we are not on track to limit global temperature rise under 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. To meet these goals, we need to shift away from baby steps to giant leaps, from incrementalism to radical action, and from excuses to execution. The Energizing Finance series delivers the hard truth about progress towards financing SDG 7. We must act now, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, where the lowest overall volume of committed finance since 2016 has been recorded. And this lack of finance to high-impact countries year after year will have far-reaching negative impacts on health, on gender inequality, and on the climate. So we must continue an ambitious and bold action on SDG 7 to ensure no one is left behind. And I'm very much looking forward to the outcomes of today's discussions for ideas on how to achieve this. So with this, thank you very much, and back to you, Tamujit.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for those insightful remarks. And indeed, we do need ambitious and bold action to ensure no one is left behind. Our next eminent guest is another key collaborator of this year's Energizing Finance research series, Ali Khan Jamal, partner at Dalberg Advisors. Ali Khan leads Dalberg's important work on inclusive growth, agriculture, food security, mobile and ICT for development, and is a critical voice for sustainable energy development. Ali Khan, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing your messages. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamajit, and thank you also to Damilola and Barbara for your opening remarks as well. I won't repeat what you both eloquently really said. In fact, I'd like to maybe just talk a little bit about just energizing finance and its approach, and how we as Dalberg also see this as an incredibly important contribution to the thinking and driving action in the sector. Dalberg is a mission-driven firm. We aim to drive and capitalize effective responses to the world's greatest challenges, and energy access is clearly one of those, especially in the context of ambitions to reach fulfillment of SDG 7, and especially in the current context around COP26 and the climate challenges that we face. Now, the way in which we tend to approach this is to take private sector style approaches to cracking problems and seeing how that can inform approaches for how you can mobilize those effective responses. What that doesn't mean is that the private sector is always just the answer on its own, but actually that the way in which we can take some of the tools to crack those issues can actually start to navigate a way through what can sometimes look like really, really difficult and intractable challenges. And where I think this is an incredibly important contribution is the way in which Energizing Finance has systematically been doing this now. It's really building up a systematic set of methodologies, rigorous understanding on both the supply side of finance and also the demand side, the types of financing that are required, but also going at least 1 or 2 levels deeper and thinking about what are the ways in which different technologies can play a role. What are the key drivers? What needs to be true? Where do we need to be thinking intelligently around subsidies, but provide the right and smartly calibrated ones and not try to distort markets? These are not straightforward issues, but the series has been building up systematically over the years to build a really nuanced picture of that. And where I think the series has got to is getting us to a view in terms of how we can start to bring together different sources of capital, be that commercially priced or concessional, and see how that comes together and starts to paint a picture of how we can start to really move the dial on some of these issues. I think, especially having worked with colleagues on Taking the Pulse, the picture that's coming out in terms of electricity access looks more reachable in some respects in terms of the level of financing required, but we do need to see the will to bring together this confluence that allows us to reach that last mile. And so we do need an intelligent application of the kinds of financing that is required. In clean cooking, I think Damilola astutely pointed out that, the numbers are really, really large. There's a lot of headway we could be making. And I think the report starts to demystify how we start to find inroads there, but we really do need to scale up our ambitions. I'll leave it there for now. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. And we'd just like to thank our colleagues and collaborators at CPI and SEforALL. It's been a pleasure working with you on this work.
Thank you, Ali Khan, for your thoughtful remarks. And we really appreciate the great collaboration that we've had with both CPI and Dalberg for the Energizing Finance research series this year. Also, thank you for teeing up the findings of this year's report so well and highlighting the scale of the finance and the ambition that is needed. It is now time to deep dive into the Energizing Finance 2021 findings. Without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Morgan Richmond, Senior Analyst at Climate Policy Initiative, who led the research for this year's Understanding the Landscape 2021 report. Morgan will share the key findings from this year's report. Morgan, the floor is yours, and please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you, Tamarjeet, and welcome everyone. As previewed in the introductory remarks, the Energizing Finance Understanding the Landscape report, developed by Sustainable Energy for All in partnership with Climate Policy Initiative and produced annually since 2017, provides a comprehensive analysis of tracked finance commitments flowing to the two key areas of energy access, electrification and clean cooking. This fifth edition of the report tracks finance for electricity and clean cooking committed in 2019 to 20 Sub-Saharan African and Asian countries, known as the High Impact Countries, or HICs, which together are home to more than 80% of people globally without energy access. I'll present in the slides that follow key findings from the report and would encourage, of course, review of the full report for further details. For the 7th consecutive year, the world is falling far short of the level of investment required to achieve energy access for all. As illustrated on the figure on the left, finance for electricity in the high-impact countries declined substantially in 2019 to $32 billion US dollars from $43.6 billion in 2018, and finance committed to residential electricity access fell to about $13 billion, less than 1/3 of the $41 billion estimated annual investment needed to attain universal electricity access by 2030. Clean cooking commitments chronically fall far short of the assessed $4.5 billion in annual investment required to achieve universal access, and annual tracked commitments have languished around $130 million between 2015 and 2019, and the continued underinvestment in clean cooking solutions year on year compounds the negative health, climate, and gender impacts caused by traditional cooking methods. Incremental progress towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7 risks being undone by COVID-19 unless drastic action is taken. Tracking SDG 7, the Energy Progress Report 2021, predicts that the population without electricity access in Sub-Saharan Africa is likely to have risen in 2020 after 6 years of decline due to COVID-19, the health crisis, as well as the associated economic downturn. Of the more than 750 million people without electricity access, over 75% are concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa. And furthermore, approximately 1/3 of the global population, or 2.6 billion people, do not have access to clean cooking. And 2.1 billion of those live in the 20 clean cooking high-impact countries, 81% of the global total. To achieve universal electricity access by 2030, Sub-Saharan Africa needs an estimated 19 billion per year in investment, while South Asia needs 10 billion. For clean cooking access, the annual investment required in Sub-Saharan Africa is 2.4 billion, and in South Asia, 2.1 billion. Most high-impact countries continue to see severe underinvestment in both electricity and in clean cooking, as shown in the figures here, where green boxes represent required investment and yellow boxes represent tracked finance committed to electricity or clean cooking access in 2019. For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, and Tanzania all continue to see a stark gap between finance committed and the assessed need in both electricity and clean cooking. Now diving deeper into findings on finance commitments to electricity. As illustrated in the figure here, where the bars represent tracked finance to electricity by country, and the yellow markers represent country-level percent of population without access to electricity, country-level progress and finance commitments to electricity has been mixed. Countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, that are most in need of finance are being left behind, while countries including India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, those three accounted for 82% of total electricity finance in 2019. For India, the relative volume of investment in electricity compared to other high-impact countries is likely attributable to population size, strong investment environment, and ambitious national policy targets reflected in high domestic, public, and private finance flows. By contrast, in the high-impact countries receiving less than $100 million in finance commitments, those on the right of the figure, towards their electricity sectors in 2019, the average proportion of the population without electricity access was 62%. In terms of sectoral breakdown, fossil fuels accounted for the largest proportion of electricity finance commitments in 2018, but grid-connected renewables took back the top spot in 2019, a promising trend towards Paris alignment. The decline in finance committed to fossil fuel-generated electricity is partially attributable to policy shifts away from coal projects in key high-impact countries, including Bangladesh and Pakistan. Both countries made explicit policy statements in 2020 to end approvals for new coal projects, which may have been seen even in the 2019 data assessed here. Tracked investment in decentralized energy, such as off-grid electricity and mini-grids, declined substantially in 2019 from 2018. This is a worrying trend as increasing mini-grid and off-grid electricity generation remains crucial to achieving universal access. Finance to decentralized energy remains orders of magnitude below the volume of finance required to deliver universal access to all electricity deficit countries. In the report, we also assess existing and potential climate resilience of finance commitments to the electricity sector in Mozambique as a case study. Mozambique's electricity sector infrastructure, both generation and supply, are highly vulnerable to projected changes in the climate, including increased frequency and severity of floods, droughts, and storms. As shown in the pie diagram here, 86% of electricity produced in Mozambique comes from hydropower, which due to climate-related risks associated with evapotranspiration, which is total water loss to the atmosphere from a land surface, and changes in precipitation, energy generation could fall 10 to 20% in the coming decades. These climate-related risks facing Mozambique are compounded by existing electricity challenges, where approximately 66% of the population is living without electricity. Recommendations from this case study to increase the climate resilience of electricity in Mozambique include that Mozambique should diversify power generation sources and transition from fossil fuels, expanding generation capacity by diversifying sources of electricity with more climate-resilient technologies, such as solar. Second, should increase investment in decentralized solutions to create a more robust electricity system, to address the affordability gap, and to build climate resilience. Decentralized electricity solutions are often more resilient to climate-related shocks than centralized generation because they can separate from the larger network and can self-start to maintain power supply without waiting for the grid to be restored. A recent positive development to this end in Mozambique is that clear regulatory frameworks are underway for off-grid energy access. Then finally, for this case study, there's a need for increased investment in climate-resilient transmission and distribution infrastructure to secure operations during climate shocks. For pre-existing transmission and distribution infrastructure, climate-proofing strategies such as higher design standards, effective cooling systems, and robust operational and maintenance procedures would be very valuable. Now, diving deeper into findings on finance commitments to clean cooking. The distribution of finance committed for clean cooking access across the high-impact countries in 2019 remains concerning, with 47% of total finance tracked in 2019 concentrated in Kenya, followed by Bangladesh, Uganda, and India. Those four countries together saw 78% of total finance committed in 2019 to the high-impact countries. Since 2013, by contrast, the three countries with the lowest total volumes of clean cooking finance commitments have been Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Pakistan. Those three received $1 million combined over the 7 years from 2013 to 2019. There's also a divide between urban and rural areas regarding the percentage of the population with no access, as illustrated by the two shades of gray in the figure here. Most of the Asian and Southeast Asian countries have a lack of access mostly in rural areas, whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa, countries see a lack of access in both urban and rural areas. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to attract significantly less finance commitments than is required to achieve universal clean cooking access by 2030. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, and Mozambique each with more than 95% of their populations without clean cooking access, continue to receive minimal finance. Further, Niger, with 98% of its population without access to clean cooking, received no public or private finance commitments in 2019 that were tracked. There were no large-scale finance commitments from multilateral development finance institutions, or DFIs, in 2019. In fact, tracked commitments from multilateral DFIs were just 4.5 million in 2019, down from 45 million in 2018, and they accounted for only 7% of total public finance. Notably, the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance (SMAP) Clean Cooking Fund, announced in 2019 and operational in 2020, is expected to increase multilateral DFI clean cooking finance commitments in future years. So there is some hope on the horizon. Notably, clean cooking investment from domestic government entities, including subsidies to address consumer affordability gap, continues to be underrepresented in this analysis due to tracking limitations. Domestic government's expenditure on clean cooking through national public budgets and transfers from central government to national governments, and sub-regional governments, including subsidies to address consumer affordability gaps, are not included in this report's tracking methodology. A bright spot that I'll note is that private finance commitments, including finance from institutional investors, impact investors, venture capital, and private equity, almost doubled in 2019, comprising 42% of total commitments. And then this case study for clean cooking provides a deep dive analysis of clean cooking policy and financing landscapes in two high-impact countries, Ghana and Vietnam, which are currently pursuing divergent technological approaches to achieve clean cooking access, as illustrated in the figures on the left, with different financing strategies employed therein. Despite progress over the first decades of the 21st century, however, tens of millions of people in Ghana and Vietnam still lack access to clean cooking and continue to cook with traditional fuels such as wood and charcoal. In Ghana, LPG has gained traction in recent years, while in Vietnam, after strong uptake of LPG, on-site residential biogas has become a commercially and technically viable, decentralized clean cooking solution for rural and peri-urban farming households. This is attributable to a long-running public-private biogas program in Vietnam, spearheaded by the Dutch development organization SNV. The key messages and recommendations that arose in the course of this case study include that in Ghana, a disciplined LPG market, that is a branded cylinder recirculation model, in line with international best practice, can create a more integrated and bankable LPG ecosystem, in turn helping to attract and catalyze investment, whilst reducing affordability constraints for consumers. Additionally, the branded cylinder model provides for better safety across the value chain. It can be paired with innovative pay-as-you-cook solutions to close both the affordability gap and accessibility gap. In Vietnam, the long-running public-private biogas program mentioned has facilitated a very decentralized clean cooking approach, creating a commercially sustainable biogas market, along with technical capacity and quality control across the country. Moving forward, the government can seek to improve its regulatory framework regarding carbon finance, a key pool of capital, and can seek technology transfer for the purposes of larger-scale urban biogas applications. In both countries, the narrative throughout the case study focuses on the idea that closing the clean cooking gap will require a comprehensive approach that considers three key policy pillars: availability, affordability, and accessibility. And then finally, shifting now to a few key recommendations. In electricity, first, public financiers must collectively increase their own funding and must accelerate efforts to mobilize commercial capital to electricity. Necessary enabling conditions for that action include increasing national government's borrowing capacity, and by extension, their access to international debt and commercial capital markets, increasing the number of accredited entities to access climate finance funds, increasing engagement and coordination between and among development finance institutions, national and regional development banks, and other institutions to better leverage finance, local experience, and expertise. Second, the adoption of policy reforms, sustainable and innovative business models, and financial instruments is important to accelerate deployment of finance to the mini-grid and off-grid sector. Several actions should be taken concurrently to increase commitment volumes and efficacy in this sector. These include increasing market support through financing mechanisms, including securitization, currency hedging, guarantees, and risk pooling, accelerating blended finance solutions to deploy grants and concessional finance alongside commercial investment to de-risk electricity projects, and formalizing licenses for private sector mini-grid developers, and developing coherent national policy around subsidy planning to increase the viability of private sector involvement. Then finally, for electricity, as seen in the case of Mozambique, sustained effort is needed to mainstream climate-related risk considerations into government policies and design planning of existing and future energy infrastructure. With ever-growing electricity demand across sectors and increasing shares of intermittent generating technologies like wind and solar, the resilience of the power sector to climate change-induced impacts is more crucial than ever. And in clean cooking, governments must make clean cooking a national priority. Depending on individual country contexts and available resources, there must be movement on all fronts, including but not limited to consumer awareness and behavioral change programs and capacity building for policy and financial institutions. It's critical that clean cooking is integrated into climate policies, electrification plans, and relevant sectoral policies, given the sector's cross-cutting nature. This includes inclusion in nationally determined contributions, NDCs, net zero roadmaps, integrated energy plans, and COVID-19 recovery plans to bring the clean cooking agenda and the associated investment need into the spotlight. Next, the current piecemeal project-by-project approach to clean cooking investment by international public financiers requires a strategic rethink. Finance commitments from DFIs have long focused on a limited number of countries and technologies, rather than a wider range of both, which is needed. And finally, increased innovation in financial instruments, as well as a drastic increase in local currency finance and blended finance, are needed to deploy the scale of capital necessary to reach universal clean cooking access. A number of business models and finance mechanisms have benefited the clean cooking sector in several countries, including results-based financing, pay-as-you-cook services, and carbon finance. To conclude, this report aims to serve as a baseline for leaders and organizations seeking to drive the energy transition and to meet the electricity and clean cooking access targets of Sustainable Development Goal 7. Much more must be done to continue to drive finance towards meeting these targets in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morgan, for setting the tone and sharing the critical findings and the strong recommendations from this year's research. The message couldn't be more sobering. A chronic lack of finance will leave billions of people in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia without electricity or clean cooking access by 2030. So where do we go from here? What is needed? What is the volume and the type of capital required to meet SDG 7? To answer these questions, I would now like to introduce our next guest, Kanishka Bhattacharya, Associate Partner, Dalberg Advisors, who will give us an overview of our second report, Energizing Finance, Taking the Pulse, 2021. Kanishka, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamujit. Let me just start sharing screens. Wonderful. So thank you very much, Tamujit, for that kind introduction. And thank you very much again to the SEforALL team for their leadership and guidance through the past months as we've developed this report. We are very excited to support the launch of the Energizing Finance 2021 series, and specifically to take this audience through some of our main findings from the Taking the Pulse 2021 report. I only have limited time. There is a lot to cover, as with other presenters, and so I will jump right in. So before diving into some of the findings, I think worth recapping the objectives of Taking the Pulse report. In many ways, it forms a mirror to what our colleagues at CPI have just taken us through in terms of understanding the landscape. Taking the Pulse was first published in 2017 by Sustainable Energy for All, and it seeks to first and foremost estimate the total volume and type of financing needed by decentralized energy, both clean cooking and electricity enterprises. And second, it aims to estimate unmet financing needs, which fundamentally refers to the household level affordability gap for end-use customers. And third, it seeks to provide some high-level recommendations on the use of funding to unlock private sector capacity and deliver energy access solutions at scale, including enabling policies and regulations for governments. Now, with that, let me maybe jump into some of our key findings. So the focus for Taking the Pulse 2021 in terms of the countries are three that are shown here: Ghana, Mozambique, and Vietnam. the reason that we choose these three countries is because they represent three distinct levels of electricity, as well as clean cooking access and market maturity. And so the lessons that they provide us reach far beyond the borders of just these three countries. The big headline message on this slide is that across all of these three countries, despite concrete progress towards SDG 7, current prospects of closing the gap appear dim. By 2030, we expect 5 million households without electricity and a much larger 20 to 30 million households without clean cooking solutions in the three focus countries. Now, let me just give you a few methodological points in terms of how we actually think about this access gap. So first of all, looking at electricity, what we do is we measure the gap to achieving universal tier 1 access. And it examines past trends within these countries in terms of level of grid electrification, mini grid, and solar home system penetration. For clean cooking, this report estimates the deficit to both universal tier 2 solutions as well as tier 3 solutions. Tier 2, tier 3 cook stoves, although less carbon intensive than traditional biomass alternatives, are not zero carbon and have negative health implications for users. The report therefore also looks at tier 4 clean cooking access. Tier 4, borrowing from the World Bank's multi-tier framework, is, as many people in this audience would know, a composite metric. It incorporates high levels of air quality, efficiency, convenience, and health and safety of cook stoves, and greater affordability and availability of clean and high quality fuel. Tier 4 access is typically only achieved with the widespread use of clean fuels like electricity or LPG or ethanol, most of which are not used at scale today. So with that in mind, again, the big message here is that in all three countries, there will be gaps. So what's needed? There's a lot to unpack on this next slide, so I will take it step by step. The first big message is a lot is needed. And really, if you think about it, first of all, achieving universal tier 4 clean cooking access across all three countries will cost about $37 to $47 billion, as Damilola had suggested and indicated at the beginning with her welcoming remarks. The variation kind of depends a little bit on the technology that is used. Most of these costs are going to be borne and driven by spending on clean fuels, which are currently much less developed and much more expensive than traditional biomass. These are the numbers that you will see on the slide reported in the green shaded bars. The diagonal white segments within that are just to show that these bars and the levels of funding that they actually represent are at an order of magnitude or at a different scale than what's needed for the transition to some of the other access to tier 1 electricity as well as tier 2, tier 3 clean cooking. Achieving universal tier 2, tier 3 cooking access by 2030, which only requires households to upgrade to cleaner, more efficient cook stoves with no real changes in fuel and infrastructure, which is a more incremental and perhaps feasible pathway by 2030, will cost about $1 billion. The need is highest in Mozambique, which is about 54% of the total tier 2, tier 3 transition costs across the three countries, followed by Ghana and Vietnam. Achieving universal tier 1 electricity access by 2030 in Ghana and Mozambique will require about $1.1 billion in additional capital. And these are the numbers that you're seeing shown on this slide, looking across both electricity as well as clean cooking, and then looking into the various segments across mini grids, home systems, as well as tier 2 and tier 4 solutions. So let's dig into this more incremental pathway a little bit more. And what we were able to do over the course of this report is really try and disaggregate the funding need, which is required for universal tier 1 electricity access as well as tier 2, tier 3 cooking, is to try and break that down into what is needed for the private sector enterprises that are going to be a strong part of the change that is required, as well as what is required in terms of plugging the affordability gap for households. So if you look at the picture here, a few sort of points start to stand out. First of all, of the 2.1 billion needed for universal tier 1 access to electricity and tier 2 clean cooking, about half will be needed in financing to support enterprises for improved cook stoves and solar home system manufacturers and distributors. More than half of this will then be in the form of grants, and most of that grant funding will actually be needed in Mozambique, as its private sector is least established among the three countries. A further 315 million, or about 31% of the total, will be needed in the form of equity, and the remainder, which is about 176 million across the three countries, will take the form of debt. The high ratio of equity to debt largely reflects the energy sector's early stage of development and maturity in these markets, and this is particularly true for clean cooking fuels and technologies. And again, I think links back to the points that we heard both in the welcoming remarks as well as what Morgan was saying, that clean cooking, even in the universal energy access space, requires special attention. Finally, about $1.1 billion will be needed in affordability gap financing, which again, to remind the audience, is calculated at the household level. This is across Ghana, Mozambique, as well as Vietnam. Unsurprisingly, given the high poverty levels that currently exist in Mozambique relative to the other countries, the other focus countries, Mozambique will account for the overwhelming share of the need, the affordability gap funding need across the three countries, mostly to drive the uptake of standalone solar in poor and rural households. The next two slides provide a little bit of an under-the-hood view of how are these estimates and numbers, what are we basing this on? What are the scenarios and pathways that we hold to be true to make these estimates? So first, diving into clean cooking, I think the message here, one is in all countries, whether we're looking at tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4, all countries will fall short of that access under business as usual. As you can see on the left-hand side, which represents access to tier 4, this access will be more difficult to achieve, driven by higher costs of fuel, as well as convenience, safety, and other requirements. Interestingly, I think for tier 4 solutions, another aspect which we looked at was the enormous amount of behavior change that may be needed to convince and persuade end users to make the transition to what, at least in the short term, could be a slightly more expensive option. And so interviews in all three countries really highlighted the need for the government and donor community to engage very deeply in marketing awareness campaigns, which can then set the stage for market players to enter and drive demand. On this next slide, we look deeper into the electricity situation. And what we see here is that universal tier 1 electricity access in Ghana and Mozambique will primarily be achieved through standalone solar. We do not look at Vietnam in this situation, just because Vietnam as a country has achieved 100% tier 1 electrification a few years ago. So when you look at this, a couple of things again come to the fore. First, across both of these countries, mini grids are expected to contribute a fairly small fraction of universal electricity access, while standalone solar home systems, in particular, will deliver access to the majority of unelectrified households currently not being served by the grid. Now, the reason is largely related to enabling environment and regulatory factors, which tend to affect the mini grid sector much more than home systems, just because of the nature of the product and service that they represent. And I think this was also referred to in just the previous presentation by Morgan. In Ghana, standalone solar will account for last mile electrification. The situation in Ghana is interesting because historically it has had a fairly strong performance of the grid, which is expected to continue. So even in 2030, business as usual, an overwhelming majority of Ghana, up to 90% of all households, will continue to be served by the grid. The remainder will be largely served by home systems. And again, it is the lack of a guiding framework for private mini-grid development, which is currently lacking and restraining the sector in Ghana. In Mozambique, standalone systems will play a much larger role given both limited grid expansion to date and in the future, and again, the mini-grid sector being constrained by some restrictive policies. I think optimistically, towards the end of this study, we did learn of, I think as Morgan referred to, the introduction or the tabling of a new regulatory framework and a more integrated regulatory framework in Mozambique, which can have a really positive effect on mini-grid growth and development were it to be sanctioned. Now let me come to some of the major challenges and recommendations. So, of course, we recognize that each country is very different. But across these countries, as we look at the different energy sectors and the different challenges, a few cross-cutting themes emerge. And these are the 8 cross-cutting challenges that you see represented on this slide. Most of, or nearly all of this, will be fairly knowledgeable to anyone who has studied energy access and looked at this, looked at the energy access sectors in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. But it's worth maybe dwelling on at least 3 of these to point out. First and foremost, I think, is the first one, which is low customer affordability. This is the costliest and most important challenge. Many customers are unable to afford the one-time cost of solutions, and it's, whether that's home systems, much less for clean cooking solutions, especially tier 4 solutions. What complicates this challenge often in these countries is the fact that really viable consumer financing options are not available or are very limited in scale. So this could be both pay-go transactions, which are enabled through mobile money, or other consumer financing options, which include financing and loans through MFIs and NBFCs and local banks. Both of these are underrepresented in at least 2 out of the 3 countries, and when as it relates to clean cooking across all 3. Second is the difficult last mile distribution, and this is again something that complicates the consumer affordability challenge, because it's often customers who are the most affordability constrained are also hardest to reach. So there is there's a lot of work that needs to be done, particularly to help support market players, both through technical assistance as well as smart subsidies or RBFs, which allow an incentivized company to overcome some of these high distribution costs and still serve customers. Finally, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the gender disparities and challenges that we observed in pretty much all 3 countries. Gender disparities related to energy access are common in many developing countries, and they affect all 3 focus countries to different degrees. Across all 3 countries, on average, women have a lower ability to pay. They have less agency than men in household purchasing decisions, including those concerning energy services. We also noted anecdotally that women's participation in modern energy supply chains, including across home systems as well as mini grids and clean cooking, is very, very low. They're largely missing from the energy sector workforce as well. And so while we would say that gender disparities are highest in Mozambique amongst the 3 focus countries, this is something that should be looked at by donors, by governments, as well as industry actors, to both enable greater agency and decision-making amongst women, to cater products and services more effectively towards them, as well as to really kind of incorporate them more effectively into energy sector value chains. Finally, let me get to some of our major recommendations. A lot of what you have here on this somewhat text-heavy slide is already kind of repeating the major points that Morgan has already mentioned. But let me dwell on 3 big takeaways for us. First, all 3 countries will require significant international public financing, mainly in the form of grants to support their nascent private sector enterprises across electricity and clean cooking. This will need to be supplemented also with fairly large-scale subsidies to address the household affordability gap, which is significant, especially in countries like Mozambique. Second, and this I think specifically relates to how to think about incentivizing the vast amounts of capital that are required, especially for tier 4 cooking, which is to really think about increasing access to carbon credits through government carbon schemes that capture carbon proceeds and apply them to expand clean fuels. This can bring down costs very effectively for customers, which remains the most critical bottleneck. And finally, there is a need for improved coordination between electricity, clean cooking, and climate efforts across all of these sectors, as well as other sectors like agriculture, to really make sure that all of the thinking, the approach is integrated and pulling in one direction, and that policies in one sector or one agency or one department are not coming in the way of policies in another. This is needed to accelerate growth and leverage the right mix of capital to close the energy access gaps that we see there. And with that, thank you very much again for the opportunity to present some of these findings. There's a lot of detail in the actual report, and would love for folks to take a look at that. Thank you, and back to you, Tamajit.
Thank you very much, Kanishka, for sharing the report's findings and for highlighting those thoughtful recommendations. The scale of the challenge for ensuring universal energy access is clear from the findings on Ghana, Mozambique, and Vietnam. Before we deep dive into the panel discussion of this event, we would like to share 2 videos with you to put in focus the messages on electricity and clean cooking access that we heard from the presentations. First, let's take a look at a video provided by our partners at SNV, which takes us all the way to Tanzania to tell us the inspiring story of Omari Komba, a steel producer who is now producing clean cook stoves, supported by technical training and results-based incentives under NDEV's Tanzania Improved Cook Stove Program. Can we have the video, please?
Miaka kadhaa baada ya kufanya kazi ya chuma, miongoni mwa wahusika wa mradi wa majiko wa SNV walipita kututembelea katika ofisi zetu. Tuambia bwana, tuna product hii tunashughulika nayo. Nikakubali, lakini nikaona kama itakuwa ni biashara gani, biashara tunaacha biashara kubwa tuje kushiriki na biashara ndogo ndogo. Wao wakatuchukua semina jinsi ya utengenezaji wa hilo jiko. Tulivorudi kaanza production. Kwanza wana technical, mambo ya kiufundi wenyewe. Kwa hiyo wakikufacilitate wao wanafuatilia na kuona jiko katika ubora kiasi gani, katika kiwango kiasi gani. Na imefikia kipindi sasa ni biashara ya jiko imekuwa ni namba 1 miongoni mwa biashara ambazo tunazifanya katika kiwanda chetu. La pili, mambo ya utawala mathalan, mambo ya biashara, uuzaji, jinsi ya utunzaji wa kumbukumbu za hizo biashara wanazofanya. Kwa hiyo nilikuwa nafuatilia. Ukifanya vizuri maana yake unapata bonus. Lakini mimi nilibeza sana kwenye vifaa. Nikapata grinder ya kukatia mabati na vyuma, nikapata drill ya kutobolea. Hivi visano unaviona naweza kuvitoboa kwa kutumia mashine. Pamoja na mashine ya kutolea risiti ya serikali, EFD mashine. Mkango na support hata program za pesa ambazo mimi bana sina hela. Tunatoa kipango cha mshahara, tunaingiza kwenye majiko sometimes, unaona?
Huwa narushia kwenye magrupu, yani picha hizo za majiko. Wanakuja kununua hapo.
Jana tumewafundisha zaidi ya 300 kupitia mkononi mwangu.
Toka nimeanza kujifunza kwangu mimi hapa, manufaa ni mengi tu na chumba changu na familia.
Kweli unaweza kaendesha biashara peke yako au kaendesha uzalishaji peke yako, si rahisi kiasi hicho. Kuitengeneza ile kasha moja uliyoiona basi shilingi 1500. Akitengeneza kasha 100 yuko mbali.
Mimi nikasema kwenye swala la kipato, bidii yako wewe mwenyewe tu, utendaji wako wa kazi, basi ndio kipato chako kinavyoingia.
Kuja swala masoko, hilo nalo tumejaribu kupambana nalo.
Katika biashara hii ya majiko ya matawi, kwa kweli mauzo, namshukuru Mungu, yanaendelea vizuri. Imenisaidia pia kutanua biashara zangu.
Cha pili, nikajaribu kufomu miundombinu au kuunda miundombinu ambayo inatufanya sisi tutembee na ile jiko kwenye mataasisi. Kuna watu tumeingia na joint venture kuwa anapoenda kuuza kuni yake lazima abebe jiko yangu mimi, lazima. Na mimi ninapoenda kuuza jiko langu site au sehemu yote Magulio, nama nibebe mkaa wake au kuni yake. Kuna wateja wazuri sana ambao tuwezi kuwasahau, mamarishe. Mamarishe wanatumia sana majiko.
Kwa sababu kwanza lina bajeti mkaa unaotumia ni kidogo, lakini unaweza kutumia mkaa kidogo, matumizi yake ukapikia vitu vingi. Na washauri mamalisho wenzangu watumie majiko haya matawi, ni mazuri sana, yatawasaidia kubajeti mkaa matumizi yao.
Kipato kinaongezeka kwa sababu si una product ambayo tayari inauzika sasa hivi. Na gari ya kubebea mzigo kwenda site na kufanya kazi za ofisi tu.
Biashara hii imeleta mafanikio kwa sababu inatusaidia kukidhi mahitaji ya kifamilia, kulipa ada za watoto na mahitaji ya nyumbani.
This is the power of providing access to clean cooking, one that can help unlock the many socio-economic and environmental gains for people and communities around the world. Thank you once again to our partners at S&V for allowing us to share this important and inspiring story from Tanzania. The next video message will put development finance in focus, especially in the context of electricity access. And who better to learn more from than an expert like Hendrik Engelmann-Pilger, Senior Energy Specialist at the European Investment Bank and a member of this year's Energizing Finance Steering Committee.
Well, as to the role of development finance, there's first, of course, a classical role of development finance institutions to provide long-term financing to energy access projects and companies, and to also to be able to mobilize concessional elements and to take risks that are beyond the capacity of commercial financiers. And thereby, then development finance institutions can come early and pave the way for commercial financiers to come in parallel at a lower risk profile or later on. And secondly, there's a very important role also to be played on a more strategic level, where development finance institutions are critical or can play a critical role in developing systematic approaches, including blending elements to unlock segments that are currently unserved by modern energy solutions. And there are, these are typically segments which are unattractive for commercial financing due to the high cost to serve, due to affordability constraints of the final end users. And it is in this context where it is critical to put together the different tools that at the disposal of DFIs in order to make these segments addressable. And this is also at the objective of current work that we're doing with Dalberg, to put these different tools, be it TA, blending elements, result-based finance, also demand-side subsidies have come out to play a very critical role, to put these together in the systematic approaches to make these segments addressable and also to mobilize in the funding that's required. Yes, that's of course a sobering finding that the financing provided to access to the modern energy solutions is not reaching the levels that would be needed to reach SDG 7. It remains a top priority, so it's not that DFIs have lost interest. One thing that comes out very clearly in the landscape report is this big need for affordability gap financing, and that is one of the elements that, if properly addressed, have the potential to really accelerate the pace of electrification financing and the segments that can be reached dramatically. And while there are some good examples of places and regions where this affordability gap financing has worked quite well. There's at the same time a big urgency to systematically develop blending approaches that can bridge this affordability gap. And that is something to be done between the different stakeholders, including development banks and donors in particular, to provide these solutions, these frameworks to expand the reach of modern electricity or energy solutions in general to these unserved populations. And that is, with these frameworks in place, a lot more funding could be mobilized to reach those segments that are currently not being targeted yet. And there's one more element that I would like to highlight in this context, which is the critical importance of high quality electrification master planning work that is supported by Sustainable Energy for All, among others, as this information basis and these, let's say, agreed plans are really the basis based on which targeted affordability gap financing solutions can then be tailored and, well, based on which the required funding would be mobilized. Thank you.
We thank Hendrik for those very practical and important perspectives. Thanks to SNV once again as well. I'm now delighted to hand over to my colleague Annette Aharonian, who will be a master of ceremony for the remaining part of the event. Annette, over to you.
Thank you, Tamerjit, for leading us brilliantly through the first part of this event. My name is Annette Aharonian, and I'm an energy analyst here at SEforALL. And I'm very pleased to take over now and dive into the second part of this launch with a very important conversation on the findings of the report. The panel discussion will allow us to hear from a diverse set of voices. This includes the role of civil society as agents of change, how to support an integrated approach to energy access that uses the full suite of solutions and taking a closer look at the potential for expansion of the clean cooking industry to generate jobs and better livelihoods, and the role of development finance in supporting the transition. A quick reminder for all of you listening, if you have questions for our panelists, please use the chat box on either the SEforALL YouTube or LinkedIn streams. To lead this discussion, I'm pleased to introduce to you Olivia Caldry, Head of Energy Finance and Clean Cooking at SEforALL. Over to you, Olivia.
Thanks very much, Annette, and hi everyone. It's great to have you with us, and I hope you found a lot of value in the presentation so far. There's a huge amount of data. What we're going to do over the next 25 minutes or so is really bring that to life with some perspectives from the ground. So we have a fantastic panel who I'll introduce momentarily, but really we've heard a lot of numbers so far. We've heard a lot about the supply side of finance. What we're going to go to in the next 20 minutes or so is sort of elevating voices from the ground and hearing from the demand side, if you like. So without further ado, I will introduce our panel. Very, very fortunate to have two of our steering committee members for the Energizing Finance Research with us today. First of all is Jacqueline Kimu, who's the International Coordinator of the Access Coalition. Welcome, Jacqueline. Access is the Alliance of CSOs for Clean Energy Access. Jacqueline has more than 7 years of experience in designing and implementing projects and programs, and she's also very experienced in enabling strategic partnerships at country and national levels in Kenya. Welcome, Jacqueline. Really looking forward to hearing your insights. Our second panelist is Uta Collier, Head of Policy of Renewable Energy Markets at IRENA. Uta has a ton of experience in renewable energy. She leads IRENA's work on policy and renewable energy markets, and she has over 30 years of experience in the fields of renewables, efficiency, and climate change policy. Prior to joining IRENA, Uta was Head of Energy for Practical Action, focusing on renewable energy solutions in energy access settings. So she has a lot of experience from the ground also. Last but not least, our third panelist is Nicholas Manu, who's the CEO of Ghana Clean Cook Clean. Nicholas is also chairman of the Ghana Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves and Fuels. He has qualifications in logistics and is a registered business consultant with over 25 years of experience working in senior positions in manufacturing, health and safety and tools. So fantastic panel with a lot of experience and some great insights into the demand side of finance for energy access. So welcome to panelists. Where I'd like to go first is to you, Jacqueline, please, and really to highlight the role of civil society in the Energy Access Challenge and getting us to SDG 7. We've heard a little bit today, and people in the audience will be well aware of the challenges of reaching the last mile in high-impact countries. Those challenges are relatively well known. We've heard about affordability, we've heard about behaviour, and we've heard about perhaps policy environments that aren't conducive to reaching the last mile. They're, of course, exacerbated by the gendered nature of energy poverty. Kanishka spoke very well to that, and financing barriers that are unique to women, whether they might be legal barriers or cultural barriers. So the question for you is, in your experience, how can civil society, including the Access Coalition, act as an agent of change in really elevating those last mile voices to policymakers and communities and the finance sector as an enabler of sustainable development more broadly? So we have energy per se, but we also have energy as a service to enable sustainable development. So tell us how you work with civil society and tell us what it can do in the sector.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for having me, and also thanks to SEforALL for the continued recognition of the role played by CSOs in achieving universal energy access by 2030. And before I deep dive on the response to that question, Olivia, I just want to mention that Access, as you said, is a global alliance of CSOs working on energy access issues across the globe. And our members and partners have experience in advocating for and also designing and delivering energy solutions to the poor and the vulnerable communities. So that said, I would like to highlight briefly on some of the examples in which CSOs, we have seen CSOs interact with the community, support the communities in different ways. And very critically, to bring out the role of energy is an enabler of development. First and foremost, I want to mention that CSOs have been doing a lot of work to stimulate demand for energy services if we are talking about energy as an enabler of the other sectors. So we know that energy services must have greatest poverty reducing impact when energy addresses the wider development needs of their communities. And for this, we have seen that communities need to understand that energy must be integrated within existing initiatives like the food security, like education, like livelihoods. In our experience as CSOs, when we go to the communities, energy is not always like the first priorities that communities want. They are talking about water, they are talking about agriculture, they are talking about food security. So as CSOs, we have been in the forefront to advocate and to actually stimulate demand for what can energy do for your agriculture, what can energy do for your food security and also other sectors. So by that, we have seen that energy is transforming their livelihoods in terms of bringing out other livelihood opportunities that are able to put money on the table for them. So it's not about talking about energy as a standalone issue. There is need for CSOs to stimulate demand for energy services. Again, we have come to realize that there is need for advocate for integrated energy planning, and I'm happy to mention that Access Coalition has developed its energy compact. And one of the things that we are looking to working in the energy access deficit countries, 20 of them, is to support and work with governments in developing integrated energy planning approaches. And this involves advocating for need-based energy planning, energy that makes sense to the local people. We have been playing a critical role in ensuring that governments, decision makers understand that energy planning must address the needs of the people that we've just talked about. And this involves building, public or rather political commitment to that, facilitating information, and also ensuring that enabling environment is there. From the reports, we have seen that there is need for enabling environment in terms of the VAT for solar home systems and other stuff. So CSOs have been very critical in that. Again, third is about bridging national and local actions. We don't want local communities just to be receivers of information. They need to be co-creators of information, and also the need for translating. We normally translate what do policy mean to the local people? Because unless we understand that, unless CSOs and local communities understand that, we will not be able to, achieve the targets that have been set, for energy. And actually, the other one is about finance. I know this has been talked about here today, and I'm happy to, that the issues of demand side subsidies have come out very well. There's need for, simulating demand side, subsidy supporting, local communities to be able to afford, energy, because affordability is one of the key issues in the energy access deficit countries, and also in the high impact countries. So as CSOs, we have been in the forefront, working with governments, bringing to life what is really working when it comes to finance, what financing options really matter for the local people, what do they want so that they are not left behind. We know that there is a lot of support for supply side subsidies, which is good, but we are saying that demand side subsidies also really matter a lot, and they are needed for us to ensure that we address the affordability gap. So some of the things that CSOs are doing are very interesting, and also, for example, linking with microfinance institutions, energy safety nets approach, which some of our members are actually engaged in. And then finally, as CSOs, we have been monitoring, compliance, monitoring government's compliance with energy access strategies and plans to ensure that now that we have the policies, now that the government has committed to doing this, how are we progressing on that? Because unless that happens, we'll not be able to, achieve, access to energy. And just to reiterate that CSOs is the bridge between the government, the communities, and also the development partners. So welcoming all stakeholders from these sectors to work with CSOs, because we are a critical element in terms of supporting achievement of SDG 7. Thank you, Olivia. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline. It's an extremely comprehensive answer that's touched on some really key issues there, and not least elevating that demand side voice and the consumer voice at every aspect of the planning stage, and indeed in design of financing solutions. So we want people ultimately to be able to access energy solutions that they'll use, but also financing solutions that are workable for them. So thank you. And it's a very good segue to my first question for Uta, and given time, might be the only question for you, Uta. We know that distributed solutions, mini-grids and off-grids, are a good, quick, effective way to get energy access to last-mile communities, remote and regional areas particularly. What we've also heard today, regrettably, is a year-on-year massive shortfall in finance to the off-grid sector, so mini-grids and off-grids. And this is even before the onset of COVID. So in your view, you have a lot of experience in this field, and you're working on these issues at IRENA. Where does that leave us in terms of SDG 7 and the longer-term energy transition? And how can the international community address this, not just one-year shortfall, but year-on-year shortfall for off-grid solutions?
Thanks, Olivia. Good evening from Abu Dhabi. I'm really pleased to be with you, and congratulations on yet another great report. I want to actually start with a more positive note. Of course, it's very frustrating to see these figures, but we're currently looking at Africa and the renewable energy developments there. And if you look at 2020, there are actually some more positive figures. It's sort of hard to get to the bottom of it, but it looks like certainly in some of the off-grid sector, especially the solar home systems, either investment has held up or even increased. So hopefully, as this becomes clearer, the trend might look a little bit better. But nevertheless, we heard earlier on that there is a huge shortfall. And the frustrating thing is we've known about the shortfall for quite a few years. IRENA, together with a number of other agencies, is of course part of the tracking SDG 7 reporting. And, year after year, we've been saying it doesn't look as if we're going to achieve the 2030 target for universal access for all. We won't achieve it in electricity. Current figures are probably at 660 million still without access. And of course, in clean cooking, it's barely going to budge from the 2.4 billion we've got at the moment. So it's not a great situation. And we really have to pull together as the international community to address this. We've heard some really good recommendations from your report about more coordination between the development institutions, the development bank, and the national governments, the private sector. It's clearly something we need. Just thinking, a few weeks ago, we had all these energy compacts, lots of great commitments made. And some of them were, of course, on energy access, but most of them didn't have a huge amount of money behind them. And I think that they're a good starting point now to actually rally people behind them. Some of the fantastic ones about however many million extra we need to give access to through off-grid. Well, we need to get the money behind that now, because it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, one other thing as well to say, I feel at the moment there is still a bit of a disconnect between the energy access discussion, which, to be honest, doesn't seem to go much beyond the development community, and the 2050 energy transition, Paris commitments, etc. discussion. We need to bring them together. I mean, here at IRENA, we're really very focused on making this a just and inclusive energy transition. And as part of that, we absolutely have to not leave all these people behind. So that's really something we just need to get out more widely.
Okay, thank you, Uta. You've hit some great points there, and you're reminding me that the IEA, of course, released its World Energy Outlook 2021 yesterday, which makes similar points and underlines the fact that finance for renewables remains the linchpin to achieving both SDG 7 by 2030, which we heard Damilola speak about earlier, as well as a net zero pathway. So we're sort of falling short on all fronts, but thank you for highlighting the nature of the challenge and the importance of collaboration and partnerships and getting the right sort of money behind them. So in the interest of time, I'll move on to a question for Nicholas, and I do want to make sure we save at least a few minutes for some questions from the audience that have come in. Nicholas, you know the Ghanaian clean cooking landscape inside out. We've heard from both Morgan and Kanishka about Ghana. I wonder if you could sort of complement Jacqueline's perspective on consumers and civil society and Uta's policy perspective with an industry perspective from Ghana. So if you could tell us a little bit about the clean cooking landscape in Ghana, and particularly what barriers industry faces in reaching its potential customers and various technology segments, and what's stopping these solutions from scaling. Nicholas, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I wonder if you're unmuted. Nicholas, still having trouble? Okay, look, while we're waiting for Nicholas Nicholas's technical issues to be sorted out, Jacqueline, I might go to you with another question if you don't mind, and that is about COVID. So the reports this year and our research has been drafted and produced in the context of COVID as we've all been living under. If you could sort of briefly tell us how the COVID pandemic's affected efforts to reach women in particular in last mile communities. So we've already heard about the challenges. What specific additional challenges have come about because of the pandemic over the past 18 months or so?
Thank you very much, Olivia, for that question. And just to put it in perspective of what CSOs have not been able to do given the current situation of the pandemic, and also how the local communities have been affected. from our perspective and the perspective of the CSOs who are working on this, we have seen that there is a lot of delay when it comes to government and also, stakeholders being able to reach, the communities. We are seeing that some of the gains that have been made on access to energy have actually gone back because of the situation with the current pandemic. Issues to do with financing again comes hand in handy in terms of, are women able to afford, their businesses have, some of them were closed during the pandemic. They are not able to access, continue with their livelihood opportunities. So that has led them to not continue with the business. And also, in a way, women who were selling, for example, the bookstores and other stuff, COVID has affected them negatively. Also, in terms of the policy side, we see that sort of engagement with stakeholders by the government and also by other stakeholders has also slowed down. And this also affects the policy side of things. So we have seen research that we did, stakeholders still prefer, the physical engagements with decision makers because they believe and we believe that is more impactful when you are advocating and when you are engaging the government. So COVID has really slowed down on that front. Yeah, maybe I can stop there for now.
Thanks, Jacqueline. As expected, I mean, we've seen supply chains dry up. We've seen sort of efforts to reach people become even more difficult. So that's to be expected. But thank you for confirming that from the field. We just have a few minutes to go, and I'm conscious that we have some questions from the audience that have come in via LinkedIn and YouTube. So thank you for sending your questions in. And I'd like to sort of invite Morgan and Kanishka back to the virtual room, as well as Michael Tsan, who's a clean cooking expert at Dalberg Advisors. Kanishka, I might send the first question to you if you don't mind, and Michael, please feel free to pitch in as well. The question from the audience is as follows. We can't continue electrification plans that are not able to empower communities. Only basic lighting and clean cooking is not enough. Could the experts talk about the amount of finance required to achieve energy access at higher tiers than just basic access? So how can we mobilize this level of finance? Kanishka and Michael, if you like, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's obviously something that I think we dwell upon quite extensively across different clients that we engage on energy access. And I think the way I think our take on it is that this is it's not an either or conversation. It's one about prioritization and sequencing. And as we've kind of harped on or across presenters, we're not yet anywhere close to achieving that even fundamental and basic level of access when it comes to just tier 1 electricity access, as well as, and I think the situation is even worse when you think about improved cook stores, which is just tier 2, tier 3. I think just coming specifically to this report, there is the reason why we stress and focus on clean cooking and not just looking at tier 2, tier 3 solutions, but actually tier 4 solutions, is to to basically point to that fact that, number one, even if you want to reach that fundamental level of access, there's still quite a ways to go, but that cannot be the stopping point. If you think about a fully fledged sort of gold standard access, actually using clean fuels that can, garner you the climate finance and climate credits that you may need, using solutions like ethanol and electricity-based solutions, the order of magnitude is just massive, right? We're talking in 3 countries to the tune of $40 billion. So while it's worth raising those numbers, we're so far away from them, just in terms of what Morgan pointed out through understanding the landscape. Sometimes, if you take those numbers to policymakers, it may not make sense immediately. So our strong view is that, we have to kind of tackle this problem incrementally. We have to make sure that there is that basic fundamental level of access. And then once that is achieved, we, I mean, there's no, it's not that we achieve that and then we all go home. It's then, okay, what's the next level, and then the level after that. But Michael, would love to hear if you wanted to come in on that.
Just maybe quickly on the clean cooking element of this. I mean, there's good news and bad news here. If you think about framing this as a story about migrating to high-tier clean cooking solutions, the good news is that even in countries like Ghana and Mozambique, for instance, in our report, you have a very substantial share of the population, the urban population, that is already using very high cost but not clean cooking fuels. So basically charcoal cooking in the case of Ghana and Mozambique. And for that population to transition to truly clean cooking solutions, the comparative cost of those solutions on an annual basis is comparable, in some cases lower, than the baseline cost of cooking with charcoal, even for very poor households, especially in countries where charcoal prices are very, very high and rising, and have risen throughout the pandemic, actually, as people have spent more time at home, spent more time cooking at home, across the kind of the socioeconomic segments in these countries. And so the good news is that that leap to clean cooking and the incremental finance required for clean cooking for urban populations in some of these countries is not sort of unfathomable. The bad news is that for rural populations, especially populations that primarily reliant on free or collected biomass, that leap is tremendous. It's hundreds of dollars US per year, even not counting for the upfront cost of the solution. It's just spending on fuel, whether we're talking about, certainly electric cooking, but also LPG and other alternatives that are being developed. So I think it's a segmented story depending on which segments one is talking about. For urban populations, it is not too much of a leap. For rural populations, we're talking about the need for very, very substantial levels of subsidy, probably channeled as carbon finance, as well as hopefully other types of targeted subsidies.
Thank you very much, Michael and Kanishka. Thank you for your insight tonight. There's a whole lot to unpack there, and I'm sorry we don't have a couple more hours for this conversation, which we really need. Just with a couple of minutes to go, I'm going to quickly go to Nicholas again to see if he's sorted out the mic issues. And Nicholas, if you're there and you can hear us okay, I'm just going to ask you a very pointed question. Would appreciate a really brief answer. You know the clean cooking industry in Ghana inside out. What would you suggest is one or two top solutions to help industries scale its solutions? So what are the top sort of one or two interventions that you'd see, particularly from a financing perspective, that would help your peers and cohorts scale your solutions? It seems we're not having a lot of luck with Nicholas today. Okay, look, in that case, and that's unfortunate, but given the time, I will respect people's time, and we do need to wrap up. So just let me thank the panel. We've had a curtailed time together today, but thank you very much for your insights and for joining us today to sort of give us that bottom-up perspective to complement the earlier presentations. I want to say a huge thanks to CPI and Dalberg personally for their collaboration this year. It's been fantastic. Fantastic work and a lot to unpack. So I'd really encourage everybody to read the reports in their own time. The steering committee as a whole, we've heard from Jacqueline and Uta and Hendrik, but I want to acknowledge the balance of the steering committee. My amazing energy finance team at SEforALL, Annette and Tamajit you've heard from today. Christina Singer is on the call as well. And last but not least, our funders, the Mott Foundation for its great support, as well as SEforALL's core funders, the IKEA Foundation, Austrian Development Agency and the Icelandic government for their support. So thank you very much. I want to respect people's time and close out. So I will hand over to my colleague Annette to wrap us up. Thanks, Annette.
Great. Thank you, Olivia, for moderation, and to all the panelists for having this discussion with us on the key findings and for taking questions from the audience. Dialogue is always critical to affecting change. With that, we've reached the end of our time together today, but just because the event is ending does not mean the work required to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030 stops here. With less than 9 years to go, action on SDG 7 must take place now. With that, I will encourage you to continue the dialogue by joining other important events happening at COP26. In fact, for the first time in COP history, Sustainable Energy for All, in partnership and support from Rockefeller Foundation and IKEA Foundation, will host a dedicated SDG 7 pavilion at COP26. The pavilion will bring together SDG 7 multi-stakeholders to mobilize and connect bold commitments and actions for energy around the world. We are looking forward to meeting you in person or virtually. Once again, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you to the amazing team at SEforALL, CPI, and Dalberg that made this event possible. Thank you to all the special guests who joined us today and to our sponsors, funders, and partners. And last but not least, thank you again to our audience. I wish everyone a good afternoon till we meet again.